So hello, everybody. As I said earlier, welcome to IAM Online for December. Just as a reminder, this is our monthly webinar focused around identity and access management, brought to you by InCommon and Internet 2. My name is Netta Caligari, InCommon Community Success Manager, and I'm very happy to be hosting this hour that we are all here together. We have a wonderful presentation lined up for you around HECVAT. So in just a second, I will turn it over to one of my wonderful colleagues who will be moderating today and presenting. But just a couple of quick notes. We will be taking questions and comments live using the Zoom chat function. So I know that there's also going to be some discussion time built into the end of this presentation. So please be thinking about any questions, any clarification you want. We want you to get as much out of this presentation as you can. So definitely save your questions and post those in the chat as they come up. We are also recording this webinar. So if you need to duck out, if you miss anything, want to go back and revisit, share it with any of your friends or colleagues. This will be posted to our IAM Online YouTube channel later this week, following up from the presentation. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. I'm happy to introduce Nick Lewis. He is our program manager for Net Plus Cloud Services and Security and Identity at Internet 2, and he will introduce our topic and presenters today. So go ahead and take it away, Nick.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Netta, for the introduction, and thanks, everyone, for attending for this month's IAM Online. We're going to talk about, as Netta said, we're going to talk about the HECVAT 3.0 updates. And with all the things talking about space going on, we're going to talk about where the HECVAT is going and hopefully to outer space. I don't know how many campuses use HECVAT for the ITAR export control areas, but hopefully you've got some good examples of unique uses for the HECVAT on your campus. And so over to John to kick us off.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon. I guess if you're in Mountain Time, we'll say good lunch. Glad you're all here to join us today. We're going to spend some time today not only going over what the updates are, but just kind of framing up the HECVAT a little bit. So we're going to go through some quick items, just explaining the HECVAT. We're going to talk through some of the 2021 updates, this unique partnership that has happened with InCommon, and some of the results of that, as well as talking through what some of the other updates were happening. And as always, we wouldn't be good in higher education if we didn't do this. This is all community driven. And so we're going to talk about some of those pieces as we look forward into 22. Next slide. So what is the HECVAT? Other than being a crazy name that fortunately, if you search on Google, it's the only thing that comes up. It really is a collaboration effort that started in 2016. Nick Lewis and I presented at a security professionals conference in 2016 about cloud services and security around cloud services. I had thrown out this idea of shared security assessments. Simultaneously, Charlie Eskew was getting ready to present a very similar topic at the REN ISAC meeting. And we all started to connect afterwards, and numerous institutions reached out at the same time. And Joanna Grama and Nick Lewis, as well as Kim Milford, all kind of said, hey, we've got something here. There is a need in the community, and we need to figure out how to bring a solution to the community. What's really unique about this is, unlike so many things we do in the community that are really driven to help the institutions, the higher education institution, this is something that helps the vendor community as well. And so it's really a win-win, and that's a very unique piece of this. The other thing is it's a unique collaboration across three very significant organizations in higher ed, with InCommon, EDUCAUSE, as well as REN ISAC. And the other piece that I often feel like we don't highlight enough, and I've realized it in some recent conversations, is this work is all licensed under Creative Commons. And so for institutions and even vendors participating, that's another assurance around what this product is that's been developed, what this collaboration is, and how it helps the community. And it's really evolved from a single questionnaire to a tool set. Higher education community vendor assessment toolkit, right? People rolls off the tongue, as you can imagine, right? And so what this is, it's a toolkit for how to manage vendor assessments in your organization and get that information in a timely, accurate manner that lets you assess risk for your institution and make decisions that frankly historically have taken significant time because we all came to the table with what I called special snowflake questionnaires. The vendors hated them. We got slow responses, and the HECVAT was really built to address that. Go on to the next slide, Nick. So if we look at the core team, it is held fairly steady since very early on. Nick, Kim, myself, Charlie were all participants very early on. Josh Callahan joined us a few years ago and brought a lot of the automated scoring capabilities into the HECVAT, which if you've used that have been super beneficial. Brian Kelly, as he joined EDUCAUSE, really encouraged us to grow up. And when I say that, I mean it in the best way. Not like your 8-year-old making poor decisions, but more growing up from the standpoint of moving from being kind of a startup, just quick execution, to really taking a step back and saying, how do we take a project and a collaborative that's been in place for 5.5 years and make it mature and sustainable? The community is very, very dependent on the HECVAT and the work that's produced by it. And how do we make sure that going forward that is there? And so it's an incredible core team that's been able to keep the momentum behind this project. And so I appreciate every day that I get the opportunity to work with these folks. Next slide. A 2021 volunteer group is actually much bigger in a lot of ways than it was traditionally. During COVID, we had a smaller group because we were trying to focus on some key things. And this year we expanded because we did partnerships. And some of that partnership piece really comes from what Brian encouraged us to do, of looking, how do we expand? How do we focus on what we should be doing as an organization with the HECVAT versus bringing in other expertise to supplement as appropriate? If you think about it, if you go from being a startup to being a larger organization, a lot of times groups do that through acquisition. Well, in higher education community, I look at that as partnerships. And so that's what we're seeing with the EDUCAUSE IT Accessibility Group, who was able to make significant contributions into the HECVAT around accessibility, with the InCommon TAC, who you'll be hearing from soon with Mary, talking about the updates that they were able to make to the IA Identity and Access Management question set. You have to realize that with the HECVAT having been originally created in 2016, a lot has happened in our technology worlds over this period of time. And questions that made a lot of sense back then certainly have aged. And so as we're coming through and doing this, we're realizing a lot of these questions have to be readdressed. And these groups are really helping with getting that piece done. Next slide. Here are the names of all the folks in their institutions who participated with the IT Accessibility Community Collaboration. One of the focuses here was not just about a one-time collaboration, but an ongoing collaboration, and making sure that we were able to produce content in the HECVAT that wasn't just something that was done and in a few years it's going to look really dated, but that this group was committing to really owning not only questions, but updates related to the HECVAT as we introduce accessibility. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because there's a lot of questions that come back about, well, you just get a VPAT, right? And I'll be honest, I'm a cybersecurity professional, I'm a CIO. I didn't know probably as much as I should have around maturity around accessibility. And I think that's one of the pieces that we can highlight here in a minute, is it's a lot more than just gathering a VPAT. And that's what was introduced into the HECVAT. Next slide. The TAC community collaboration, which is one of the big reasons we're here today to talk, is really going back and finding an organization who understood identity, who understood authentication as it applied to higher education. And who better to do that than in the InCommon TAC group? And Mary and Stephen and Mark and Nicole all really helped lead that collaboration and develop what I would call very up-to-date and applicable questions within the HECVAT that is going to allow institutions to do a lot more than we probably were able to do accurately before in that IAM space. And so I look forward to having Mary share shortly what that all looks like. But this is another collaboration where it's about more than just updating the questions. It's really about having that partnership where they are becoming a part of the HECVAT team and making sure that that area that they're focused on is updated, is questions are being answered, all those other pieces. So it's exciting to see us be able to expand into these areas. I will mention One of the other key areas that we hear about all the time is privacy. And we have certainly started to work on a partnership around privacy. The challenge with privacy, and I know all the core team members can tell you the robust conversations we've had in this space, and we've met with the community group and EDUCAUSE in this space. It's really hard at this time with the diversity of privacy regulations to get to the point we need to have a clear control set questionnaire for HECVAT around privacy. So no, that's absolutely a conversation we're keeping front of mind. Next slide. Here's the tooling group. I always joke, these are the folks, nuts and bolts, down in the details. How does scoring work? How do we make sure that this tool is actually delivering what the expectations are of not only our community members, but our vendor community members? And when that crazy question comes in where a vendor's like, hey, this scoring is not accurate, Josh, Tom, Charlie, Laura jump in right away and are able to help address that. And sometimes it's a user issue, and occasionally there's an issue on the back end, right? I mean, when you really dig into the nuts and bolts of what's been built in Excel spreadsheet, it's mind-boggling. And this is the lead team that's making that happen. And without them, frankly, the HECVAT would be a Word document. And so they really have done an amazing job of not only bringing it initially to reality, especially with the automated scoring, but then continuing to maintain and update it going forward. Next slide. Okay, so this is an eye chart. I will admit it. HECVAT is being adopted by numerous institutions. If your institution is not on this list and your institution would allow us to recognize you as using the HECVAT, please reach out. We'll have some contact information here at the end of the presentation, but this is really powerful when we're engaging the vendor community. When you're able to say, hey, you complete this questionnaire once and there's 134, not just campuses, because if you look at this, many of them are systems as well. So there's a multiplier involved there that accept this document as a baseline security control assessment document. That means a lot to the vendor community. I was speaking with one vendor about 18 months ago and having a conversation, and I mentioned the HECVAT and how we'd done it. And the vendor proceeded to tell me how it had changed their life and how they had spent their evenings, this particular analyst, just completing questionnaires that came in from campuses. And that's what they did. And they got so much time back as an organization by not having to do special questionnaires, having a standardized document that they could invest in once a year, that then is adopted by all of these campuses. So know that our voices in concert are extremely powerful, and the vendor community listens and we both benefit. Next slide. Here's another interesting perspective that I think when we started this, we probably never would have expected. But more and more, we're seeing that vendors are adopting and really advertising via the Cloud Broker Index that they are using the HECVAT. So it's not just that we're requesting the HECVAT from them. They are wanting to push out and say, hey, look at us, look what we're doing, look how we're leveraging this. And I mean, you can see the growth. I mean, this is just in the last 12 months, the number of groups that we've seen publicly come out and want to be recognized for their use of the HECVAT. Next slide. Service providers. So this is an even what I would call application of the HECVAT, right? So we go from those who are creating it around their own product, us as campuses who are using it more as a consumer to evaluate, to groups that are building these into vendor evaluations and GRC tools, which under the licensing is allowed. Clearly, you know, they can't charge specifically for the HECVAT being in there or a HECVAT module under the Creative Commons licensing. But if you license a product and they have already built in HECVAT evaluation, here's a great example of vendors who have built products around leveraging the HECVAT. And so that's super exciting to see that it's not just the two communities. We now have this as a recognized tool that's being used with vendor assessment within third-party products as well, which is a big step forward. Next slide.
John, let's pause for a second. We've got a couple questions that have come in that are relevant to the CBI. From a question from Karen: should we encourage providers, vendors to get on that list? We asked a vendor recently who has it but are not listed. I don't know if they have even considered that.
I think that's a great question. Absolutely. I think if nothing else, it shows a commitment to higher education. It's a fairly easy process for them to go through. Cheryl with REN ISAC kind of leads that effort of engaging those vendors, but it shows very publicly, hey, we are committed to higher education as a vertical. We understand what the expectations are around higher education assessments as far as cybersecurity assessments and control assessment. So I think for them, it really makes a statement. Now, for us as institutions, it gives us a quick place to go to say, hey, is this a vendor who really engages and understands us? And so I think there is both sides of that conversation. I would be the first to acknowledge we have mentioned it in presentations a lot. We probably need to get out into the HECVAT user community group and be highlighting that as, hey, anytime you engage a vendor, say this, just, hey, have you completed a HECVAT? Yes. Oh, are you listed on the community broker index? No. Oh, well, let me tell you about it. At the end of the day, it's interesting. We've all become a little bit of salespeople when it comes to the HECVAT. And so anywhere where we can make that push of, hey, there's another thing you can do that really helps you and us as an organization, I think there's a great upside to that.
There's another question from Carolyn that I'll answer. What's the difference in the chart you showed on that slide, the CBI slide, and the difference on what's on the REN ISAC page? So that slide was just the new vendors as of 2021 for this year. Obviously, we're pretty close to 2022, and so the CBI list is continuing to grow. So that's the difference. Basically, the full vendor list is like, I don't know, 80 or something, and it just doesn't fit on a slide. But putting all the campuses on a slide is that good eye chart. So back to you, John.
Oh, thank you, Nick. And I think the other thing to highlight is REN ISAC and Cheryl have really committed to engaging these vendors so that they understand the expectations of, really, you shouldn't have a HECVAT that's 3 years old, right? Let's have a conversation around, let's try to get these HECVATs updated. Let's make sure that they're current with what your actual products are. We live in a space now where the vendor velocity of changes is so rapid that their HECVATs need to be managed like that as well. And for them, rather than being, a campus N number, it's an N of 1. You do this once and it's adopted across the community. So there's definitely some upsides to that for us to being able to get accurate information and seeing, when was their HECVAT actually created? And there's some encouragement to continue to maintain that. Next slide. So let's talk through some of the 2021 updates, and we're going to dive a little deeper into some of them here in a minute, but updated questions to reflect the modern cloud. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these questions came out of 2015, 2016. They've been tweaked, but they hadn't really been a deep dive. Like, is this really the way we would state this question, or does this really gather the information that we're looking for? A lot of this was also reflective of what's happened in the last year. So as we talk about things like supply chain issues, are we asking questions that the vendor's just responding very generically in most of the times, and we need to phrase the question a little bit differently to make sure we're getting to the root of, okay, when you talk about the responsibilities piece, let's make sure we understand what your area is and how you're doing that. So that's a big piece of the puzzle, and a significant amount of time went into really going through and doing that. In addition, was updating the guidance for each of those questions to make sure that there's clear understanding of what are we trying to capture, especially for vendors, right? We understand our world. We're all coming from similar contexts, being in higher education. I know we probably have some vendors on as well, but we want to make sure that we're providing that guidance so that they're able to get the right context in the information that they're responding with. As we're going to talk about here in a minute with Mary, we've got the huge deep dive into the identity and access management, and the TAC did an amazing job really going through there, redesigning, rethinking, and restructuring what's happened with that space and the questions that happened there. We've also done a lot to make it easier to maintain this going forward for third-party tools. So ability to kind of export all the answers, to see everything in a much easier way in one tab. And that was a big piece of work for the tooling team as well. And so there's been a bunch of pieces happen in that space. The other one that I will highlight quickly is the accessibility inclusion was massive. And that was a huge update that really, I think, showed the commitment of the HECVAT team and the participant organizations of making sure this tool is updated in such a way that it's addressing the needs of the campus as well as the vendor community. So let's go to the next slide. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Mary and let her talk through the identity and access management updates.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited about this because, as John said, this is a great partnership that I think really helps our community amplify shared needs for the benefit of all involved. That's institutions and solution providers alike. I'd also like to reiterate John's note about my TAC colleagues who helped with these recommendations, Nicole Roy, Mark Rank, and Steve Primo. That group really kind of represents a number of different perspectives on this problem, from the federation side to the solution provider side to institutions from different sort of sizes and configurations and IAM needs. And I think in addition to trying to update some of the language to reflect the latest best practices, we also really want to make sure that the language is inclusive enough that it can accommodate different institutional needs within sort of the larger framework of common goals. So obviously, the InCommon TAC is focused on common standards in the research and education community. But since we recognize that higher ed IAM standards are not necessarily one size fits all, we have proposed two different types of changes to the wording. The first thing is general changes that speak to shifts in industry best practices. So that includes removing rotating password requirements, which is no longer recommended by NIST digital identity guidelines, as well as authorization language to encourage permissions that are rule-based, if not role-based. So I think for a long time, role-based access control was considered to be kind of the gold standard in access control. These days, we see things like policy and attribute access control, or policy and attribute-based access control, which can be at least as sophisticated, if not more. So we want to be a little bit more inclusive about, it's not just discretionary access control. You do have some sort of rule framework for providing and revoking access, but we can be a little bit more open about that. We also recommended more general language about integrating with an institutional single sign-on provider, acknowledging that even within higher ed, there are diverse patterns for accomplishing that. And we really wanted to ask these questions in a way that fleshes out the answers that each HECVAT using organization will be able to use to differentiate and see, is this going to work with what we support at this organization? More specific to our community are best practices for identity and access management in what are sometimes known as high level of assurance contexts. So it's critical for our community to work in ways that are closer to, say, government or banking than a startup where it really doesn't matter who your users are. All you really need is a web browser and an email address. In higher ed, it's really important for security that we know who you are and we have some sort of assurance on your identity, and that has some implications on how you run your IAM best practices. So to that end, the question recommendations call out some pain points that are very common in the research and education community, including use of email addresses as a user identifier, very, very common in industry, really, really problematic in higher ed. Also attribute mapping. So many of you might be supporting attribute mapping standards like the EDUCAUSE specification to help with federation and other things. We really want to make sure that instead of having the burden be on the institution to map, oh, here's our single sign-on, we call first name this, and this vendor calls it this, but this other vendor calls it something else. If you follow a standard like EDUCAUSE or something else that might be relevant to your organization, we want to make sure that we can call out whether the vendor is able to adapt to what your single sign-on calls that attribute, so that we can all standardize a little bit more. And finally, we've reframed references to InCommon to refer to adoption of key standards that InCommon endorses, as opposed to just mentioning InCommon. So that might include like the SAML2 specification and other things that I think InCommon does a great job of representing United States interests in the larger EDUCAUSE global interfederation R&E community. And so we want to make sure that we make some more general references to, as a vendor, do you participate in a trust framework? That may be InCommon, which represents the United States in EDUCAUSE. It might be another national federation that InCommon can help us connect to. So just kind of noting that we have that ability to interoperate through InCommon. Do you have that ability? Because that will make integration much easier for everyone and much more secure. I think we can move on to the specific questions, which,
so Mary, there's a question in chat. Is the REFED's research and scholarship standard attribute bundle referenced?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We wanted to keep it fairly. We can go to the next page to look at the specific questions. We did make some recommendations about including some of those specific standards in the sort of larger HECVAT full context and keep an eye on that. But we want to be mindful of not asking among our group. If we could have asked 75 questions, we would have, but I'm not sure that the solution providers would have appreciated that. That is absolutely something when we talk about participation in a trust framework like InCommon, that comes along with those best practices that federation requires. Like, do you have the ability to support REFED's MFA? Do you have that ability to support the research and scholarship entity category? And not just these things, which are at a point in time, but can you signal an ongoing commitment to say, as those standards evolve, are you keeping up with the standards? Because right now we're looking at entity categories like research and scholarship, which for anyone on the call who's not familiar with research and scholarship is a way for solution providers to signal the Federation has validated that this is a legitimate research and scholarship application, and any institutional identity provider, Duke's single sign-on interface will automatically integrate through InCommon with any solution provider. And this is a great option for researchers. But there are other entity categories that are in flight. We want to make sure that all of those things, as the federations produce them and the larger community produces them, that we're able to really hone in on, are you tracking that work? Are you committed to that work? Are you part of that community? I think there's another question in here about common identifiers, like the EduPerson principal name.
Yeah,
that is a great question. And the way that we get at that answer is by talking about flexible attribute mapping. So what we don't want is to be having to, every time your organization integrates with a new solution provider, we don't want to say, oh, well, this solution provider needs you to assert this special identifier that is specific to the solution, that is formatted in this way, because that really doesn't scale very well for the organization. And so by asking about flexibility for attribute mapping, we are able to accommodate people who are using the EduPerson principal name common identifier. We also see that there are other identifiers that are kind of up and coming in that community. And we want to make sure that we're meeting people where they are. Maybe as we're transitioning from the older identifiers to the new identifiers, we want to make sure that the HECVAT accounts for people no matter where they are sort of in that evolution, without asking. We don't ask specifically about EduPerson, but we do ask a question that would allow you to verify that you could use the EduPerson principal name if that's what you maintain at your organization. So I think we can go on to the questions if there's nothing else in the chat on that. So I think you'll find, I won't read every single one, but I think that you'll find that they're intended to be fairly generic to kind of help get at some of these questions that are very important to some of us, but may not be relevant to all of us in exactly the same way. And these questions are intended to elicit either a plain yes or no answer, or let us know, what is it that you support? Because I think a lot of us support multiple protocols and we can be flexible, but we don't all have the same tool sets. And we want to make sure that we're asking that question in a generic enough way. In addition to asking either yes or no, or which things do you support in this category, we've also tightened up some language to help clarify whether the ability of a solution provider to use your campus single sign-on infrastructure or your campus authorization and group management infrastructure can be applicable to all users, including admins, or if there's multiple ways that you can get into the application. Because of course, as security professionals, if you are not able to to assure that everyone is using the system you've already secured, you now also have to worry about securing what the solution provider is doing and making sure that you've signed off on that. So instead of saying, can you support it? It's, can you support it for everyone, including admins, or can you do both? That is one of the questions that we'd like to flesh out, because we think that in an evaluation, that's an important thing for people to look at. And then one last thing that I wanted to call out here was that, to be pragmatic, we realize that not every solution provider is going to be able to tap into institutional single sign-on and other infrastructure. In that case, we want to make sure that there's an opportunity for those solution providers to signal that they have a single standalone multi-factor authentication solution that is local to that application. I think usually what we would hope is you use your campus infrastructure, and through that you use your campus multi-factor authentication provider. But if you're not able to tap into that infrastructure, you need some sort of compensating control to make sure that you still have that second layer of checking, and that you still have an option for MFA. So that's another one of those pragmatic questions. Let's meet people where we are on both sides, both from the institutional maturity level as well as what the vendor is able to support. So high level, if there's any quick questions, we could probably take that. And otherwise, I'll pass it back to Charlie to keep us going.
I don't see any other questions, so thank you, Mary. You've seen 3.0 is a huge leap forward for those of us who use the HECVAT. So you've seen quite a few updates so far during the presentation here, but I'll just chime in for a few extra just quality pieces that we'd like to add. So times have changed quite a bit. We did not have a release in 2020. So we've had quite a few things on our plate trying to deliver for the community. Like John said earlier, we are community driven. We are listening to vendors, we are listening to the community, those of us who are using it, and we're making changes appropriately. Vendors want to know how to better represent their environments. Analysts and assessors want to know how to better assess those vendors' responses. So we've done a couple of things. John mentioned a couple of things earlier, but really we refreshed the analyst reference information. So we've had that for a while now, but we really wanted to do a deep dive so that both parties, both sides better understood the context of the question, why we're asking it. The other thing John mentioned is the authoritative source is now the questions tab. So if you go and look in the questions tab now, everything is consistent. You can read one question in every component all the way across. So it makes it a little easier to digest. It was some of the authoritative pieces were all over the place before, and it was a little bit difficult to follow. So we tried to take some action on that. As I talk about the questions tab, really we'd like to revisit. We revisited every question in the HECVAT Lite, retired things that were no longer relevant, refreshed them where necessary, consolidated where appropriate, updated guidance, all types of things. So there's all kinds of new things in there that we won't go over. There's a long list, but we won't cover that today. There's probably 2 or 3 things we really want to cover. I'll hand it off to Josh here in just a second, but first I want to cover what we really like to share, and that's the analyst report tab. Next slide for me, please, Nick. Any of you who have worked in the HECVAT and digested or assessed vendor's response knows that we always had this analyst report, but there was no consistent way to override a vendor's answers. We could ask them, do you do encryption in transit? Yes, we don't do encryption in transit. They get the bonus points, their score looks good, but that's not, we always had to go back and override that. If you look at this now, this is just a screenshot of the 5 columns to the right, but you'll see what we've done here. We have a consistent place to add assessors' notes, and these get populated back into the front HECVAT Lite so that vendors will better understand what security analysts and assessors are concerned about. And you'll also see that we gave everybody the opportunity to see what the preferred response is. what we're looking for, how they get a positive response here, and then the ability to override it. Vendor might have said yes or no, they don't cover this, but you might read their additional information and you can override that, say, yeah, your compensating controls do meet my sufficient standard of due care or whatnot. And so you can override that. The other thing that we got from the community is that, when we first published, we still publish for the one size fits all. We're a large community, we're quite diverse. But in some cases, when an institution is digesting a HECVAT, it's for a very specific use case, and there are controls that are more important than the others. And we've heard from the community that they would like to adjust the weights on the questions so that they could make the reports more appropriate for their risk tolerance of their institution. So now we have, if you do nothing with the weight override, it takes the questions, takes the default weights, and all the reporting works. But for your institution, if something is more concerning to you, you can override that and so cleanly so that you can get the reporting in line with your institution. So these are a couple major things that we've done for the analyst report. And I'm going to hand it over to Josh. I don't see any other questions in here for me, but I'll pass it to Josh and let him handle the next couple of slides. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, it's me. You can all hear me. Can you move one slide ahead? Wanted to highlight one of the things in the full, which is coming out this month, is we updated these qualifier sections that change which pieces are required. And there used to be a mobile app question here that we got rid of because basically everyone has a mobile app, and we moved all those questions into the application section. And we got a start here on something we've been mulling over how to handle for a while, which is now Qualifier 7, which is select your hosting option. And so vendors can say if they're self-hosting, if they're doing physical co-location, virtual co-location, if they're in AWS or Azure or Google Cloud platform, and then we're asking them questions that are relevant to that. So if you're in AWS, we're not going to ask if you have done a SOC 2 type 2 evaluation. You can share that because, well, frankly, I'm sick of companies that are hosted in AWS giving me Amazon's SOC 2 type 2 and saying, look, see, we're secure, we're in Amazon, and they've had this analysis done, which tells me nothing about the 574 choices that they've made with the Amazon containers that they've rolled out. So it's not, what we have in the full version 3 that's coming out this month isn't 100% of where we are, but we've got those questions separated, and depending on what they choose here, different things are grayed out versus required. And then we've got that foothold. So we're going to be working in future rounds to get a really good set of AWS targeted questions and GCP targeted questions and Azure. But that was a good, important thing I thought to highlight, and kind of feeds into the way we handled the IAM questions that we got from Mary's group. And if you move to the nenext slide, Nick, look at those a little bit.
Josh, before you go on to the next slide,
Yep.
There's a question about the hosting option that you just mentioned. Qual-07, you can only choose one hosting option. What if part is colo and part is cloud hosted?
I think we have in other, look real quick where they can define that. And yeah, they can do option 7 is other, and they can describe what that is.
Thank you. All right, next slide. There you go.
And we tried to keep, I think this, most of these questions are the same in both versions. And so a lot of these strikeouts that you see here are based on how the vendors answered the first 2 questions. And so depending on those combinations of questions, they're going to get a different subset of the total of 19 questions in the AI here. So we're not asking about, if you participate in InCommon or other educatability to trust federations, if you say no, you don't support SSO. So we, had that set of relationships and little challenging to get it all dialed in, but we got that in place. I think, yeah, that's pretty much the main highlight we wanted to do here. And we didn't want to kind of go back and forth to, you know, a whole spreadsheet, but this is how that looks. Go ahead and go back to Nick.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. Now on to the last couple of things. We'll have time for QA. We've got a couple questions that have come in that we'll get to. But before we get to the QA section, we're going to talk a little bit about community expectations. So we know that campuses are still just hearing about the HECVAT 3.0 Lite updates, and we're still working on getting the Lite out. And so we're asking for the service provider community and campuses to start asking for the 3.0, and we're asking that service providers migrate to using the HECVAT 3.0 during a regularly scheduled update cycles. So campuses like getting those updates on an annual basis. And so the next time they come up and the campus wants an update, hopefully you'll be able to have the HECVAT 3 ready for those campuses when they get there. And so on an annual basis, and we to incorporate also to incorporate the HECVAT 3 into your processes and documentation on campus if you need to make any changes to how your current processes work, because we know many campuses have included HECVAT into their procurement documentation or security assessment processes. And so we want you to make any updates that are necessary to your process to incorporate the 3.0. And then we really want to hear your feedback for future updates. One of the things that John and the core group we've really emphasized is we take your feedback and then we incorporate that into our next version. So we want to know your feedback on how this worked and anything that areas where we can incorporate in for future developments or any future feedback. And then next steps. So the next steps for the HECVAT update were, as Josh and Charlie and we've all mentioned a bit, the HECVAT full 3.0 is still underway. We'll get that out to the community. We're finishing up some final touches on that around crosswalks and some final QA. Then after that, we'll look at the on-prem version, and then potentially we may or may not need to actually make any updates to the triage tool because it's a little bit different. But those are some of the next steps. And the crosswalks in the HECVAT full is something that we definitely know that are pending to get updates, and we need you to get involved and to help us finish those crosswalks. And so if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to us and get involved. And then also same thing for documentation. The HECVAT core group has been very involved in getting the core tool updated and trying to improve awareness across the community and some bare bones documentation, but we know that there's a bigger need in higher education for additional documentation, and also in the service provider community of documentation. And so we need your help to make that smoother and to make it easier for new campuses to start using the HECVAT. And so if you're interested in working on that, please reach out to us. And I know that I've gotten several people have contacted me about helping with the documentation, and we're going to have that as a real focus at the start of the new year. And now time for questions and feedback. I see that there's been a couple questions in chat, and so we'll start with the questions in chat. There was a question a couple minutes ago around the vendor list is good, but 30 vendors compared to the many that are engaged with EDU seems to be small representation. How do more vendors get engaged? Anybody on the core team want to answer that before I say something?
Yeah, Nick, I can jump in. I think a lot of it is awareness, and it's having a place to speak with that vendor community. As you can imagine, many times this core group, as we do presentations and things, it's more of the higher education community we're talking to. As I look through the list here, I see that we have some vendors participating today, which is great. Some of the service providers, but as well, we've in the past done the same thing with EDUCAUSE, trying to engage the service provider community there. So it's really about focus. And at the end of the day, the voices on this call, on this webinar, are the most powerful ones to make that impact, right? So if you make people aware of that community broker index and that you look to it as a place to understand vendor community, what folks are committed to higher education, those words have impact. And so making sure that you guys are the voices kind of carrying that message and being the evangelists a bit for this is really critical. And it's the reason we've had as much success that's already happened, is because the community has held together and said, hey, everybody, we expect that you use this tool. As a next step, we expect that you're publicly acknowledging that you're using this tool. So that's really a big piece of the puzzle. And Nick, what your thoughts?
That's exactly it. We need you to reach out. We've gotten from our internal core team calls, we've heard from the REN ISAC around campuses getting seem to have incorporated the CBI and HECVAT into their standard procurement processes. And so every time they do an RFP, we'll get a new service provider into the CBI, because they put as part of their procurement process that the service provider need to be listed in the CBI. And so it's you reaching out and telling your service providers that you want them to use the HECVAT and to participate. And then there's a sort of a related question around any thoughts regarding guidance for vendors to choose which HECVAT version to use. They all seem to default to light since it's easier.
I think it's more than just it being easier, Nick. I think one of the things that we recognized early on as we were creating the HECVAT is that for a lot of the engagements with service providers we have, having 200 plus questions on controls really didn't align to the risk that the potential product had for our campus, right? And that's where light obviously came into play, and the tooling team did a great job of creating that reduced tool that really is applicable to those situations. And I've talked to campuses, on many campuses, it's 70% of our engagements are around light. Some of them it's 90%. Many times the full has to do with what level of risk are we talking about? Is it PII, right? Is it handling credit cards? Sorry. Those are the pieces that I think we need to concentrate on. But the other piece I would say is be careful in educating vendors. Their tools could be generic and used in a lot of different ways. And maybe it's better for them to do a full initially so that they could just share that out automatically versus having to maintain two versions. And so there's certainly been cases where I talk to vendors, I'm like, you realize an institution may choose to do X with your platform, whether it be store CUI or other things in it. You guys say you can do it. You need to have the documentation to back that up. And so I think that's a really critical piece is in that conversation. But just because somebody's only completing a light doesn't mean they're not committed and they're looking for the easy road. It may be the piece that's applicable unless the risk posture for your institution and usage of the tool is different. So it's one of those things, as I think about it, in some ways, light makes it feel like, oh, it's not as good or something like that. And maybe that's something you could tell. We're not marketing people. I don't know if that's come through clearly yet, HECVAT. But that's a piece that from a premise standpoint, I think we hadn't even considered. Charlie, Josh, anything you guys have on that? I know that you guys dig on that a lot and think about the comparison of the two.
Go ahead, Josh.
I was just going to say, I pretty much never ask for lights because, the way my purchasing process works, I'm really looking only at high risk situations where they're hosting protected data. But I get, when I get lights, I'll look at that risk factor, talk to the department that's requesting the product about usage, and sometimes that's okay. But generally, if I'm going to look at someone, I want the more detail. So.
I think that kind of answers, Bruce, your question to summarize the key differences between the light and the full. We're asking about the same things, but the level of detail we're asking from the vendor is much lighter. So it helps us make better use of our resources, because in some cases when we share institutional data with third parties, it's of a classification that just doesn't warrant the amount of resources it would take to get through a full. So that's when you would use a light and a full, one versus the other. And it's always, we champion, it's up to the customer, us users of higher ed, we're the ones who determine whether or not we want a light or a full. So it's our risk tolerance. It's the type of data that we are putting into their platform or infrastructure. That's what determines what you should be using to assess it.
And Charlie, I wonder maybe you and Josh could say something about some of our collaboration with the EDUCAUSE IT accessibility work group and how they thought about just including the accessibility questions in the light, because that's what it seems like a majority of the service providers have been completing.
Yeah, sure. I'll speak to that. And that was kind of one of those awakening moments. John spoke about this too, like understanding the situation, but not really understanding the situation. And what we were thinking is there was some pushback to add extra questions to the light. We want to keep this refined, make it usable real quickly. IT accessibility they actually made the case that it was those enterprise products that have large development teams actually do IT accessibility quite well. It's these small softwares as a service, these smaller institutions that aren't able to do that or compensate in these other ways. So they made the case for us to add that to the light, and it fits perfectly.
Thanks, Charlie. Just catching up with the questions in the chat. Any other questions?
Nick, there's a question there from Paul, and I'd like to kind of address, we get this a lot, right? Around vendors asking about scoring, raising their scoring and things like that. And I want to address it from this standpoint. It's kind of a twofold. And Paul, and I'll throw my email address, John, Jon_Allen, ALLEN at Baylor.edu. Happy to kind of help guide you guys on this stuff from this perspective. This is a group of volunteers, right? And even though, you know, some of these groups are, you know, Nick's with Internet too, this is a small portion of his responsibilities and Brian's responsibilities. And so the great part is we're starting to see vendors in this space who are willing to work with other vendors, i.e. their consultants, to help with evaluating your HECVAT. How do you raise your score? And so happy to help make those connections. Because at the end of the day, for this team, we want to make sure the focus is really on producing the tool set for the community, not necessarily gauging any single vendor or provider on their particular piece. Now, if there's an error, if there's a question about, you know, why is the question phrased this way? Absolutely. But I think we're seeing now a robust community buildup around the HECVAT, such that there's going to be resources available for both the service provider community and frankly, even for institutions, right? If institutions end up being shorthanded and unable to really evaluate a HECVAT, there's resources available in that consultant community as well with people familiar with those tool sets and how to do security evaluation. So please don't look at that as me, you know, pushing off, but I also want to be very respectful of this is a community volunteer effort, and we want to make sure to keep that piece focused and then allow those other pieces to tangentially grow upon what's being built with this group.
Josh is typing answer to one of the questions from QA. While he's typing that out, there's a question in chat about doing a workshop at NERComp. So what we've done many times in the past is that EDUCAUSE annual or EDUCAUSE cybersecurity and privacy professionals was security professionals conference would do a half day or full day workshop. We've done ones at the Internet 2 meetings. We've talked about doing these training sessions at other regional events because we know that's been one of the most popular ways or most that campuses have learned about the HECVAT because of as we've talked about, there's not a lot of documentation. And as John mentioned, we're cybersecurity professionals primarily focused on the cybersecurity and privacy and identity community. And so writing documentation is not always the first thing that we want to do. And so, but we want to share and make this easier for campuses, because we know everyone's going through many of these same problems. And so we've done this via presentations and workshops. And so maybe we could do a train the trainer, like go out and do to workshops, or if you send a request into the core team, maybe we can figure out how to do that. Maybe there's a suggestion to Internet to EDUCAUSE and an ISAC of, oh, maybe more needs to be done there. But we want to hear your feedback because we know that there's a lot of benefit once you get a little bit more training, because it is a specialized area of cybersecurity. Anybody else on the core team have any comments on that? And then part of the question was also about smaller schools, and that's where some of the community efforts around, like the Community Broker Index, the Internet to Cloud Scorecard, the EDUCAUSE vendor risk assessment, where we're trying to do some of this at the community scale, but that still leaves a place for your campus to be involved, of trying to figure out what your data is in that cloud service to make sure that you've properly assessing that for what your local use cases are. Any other comments? I guess Karen says maybe doing another webinar. So yeah, we can definitely do another webinar. We've done a number of community calls in the past where we try to do this sharing of how to use the HECVAT. Today, we're just talking obviously about the updates that have been made in 2021. But yeah, we'll take that note to do more, maybe another webinar for training. Any other comments from the group before we go over to Netta to close us out?
All right, I think we are then ready to wrap up. Thank you, everybody. This was a really engaging IAM Online, and we're really happy to see all of the interest around this area. So as Susan posted in the chat, we will be making this recording available to all of you. And so you'll be able to review at your leisure after the webinar. So thanks again to everyone who joined in today. I'm going to share my screen here. And just wrap up with a few last minute announcements before we all drop off today. So let me present. All right, so this was our last IAM Online for 2021. IAM Online for the following year will be coming out soon in terms of details and themes. We are always looking for stories about the work that's happening in our communities from all of you. So if you have a cool story to share, you have something that you're working on that you think would be of interest to others, you can always contact me. My email's there. And again, we could just have a conversation around you presenting and sharing your story with IAM Online. For 2021, like I said, we record all of these. So if you missed a presentation, you want to go back and review, you can always visit our YouTube page that's listed. When you close out of your Zoom today, there will be a quick survey just to collect some feedback on how you enjoyed today's session. And I believe there's also possibly an open field for you to give us feedback on anything that you would like to see moving into next year. So that feedback is really helpful for us to determine what you want to see and what we can continue to offer you in terms of information and collaboration. So if you can please fill out that survey, we would very much appreciate it. And then just to wrap up, a couple of announcements. We have announced our training sessions that are going to be available into next year and all of our workshops around our software suite. So you'll see we'll be kicking off with Grouper and then going to co-managed Shibboleth and then midpoint back to Grouper again later in the year. So more information will be listed. But if you have any interest in implementing or learning more about the software that we provide, please consider joining us for one of our trainings. All right, and that's what I have for today. So again, thank you to all of our presenters that joined in today. Thank you for everybody who asked questions. This is really wonderful to see all of the interest, and I'm so pleased. So I hope everybody has a wonderful winter, happy holidays, enjoy the times with your family at the end of the year, and then we'll kick off strong early next year. Thanks, everybody.